2016 was a year that was marked by a series of events that challenged the perceptions of intelligence analysts, that overturned the predictions of pollsters. We saw things like the result in the UK referendum to leave the European Union. We saw the election of Donald Trump in November. And looking beyond that, there were also a series of disruptive events in the world, for instance, the attempted coup that took place in Turkey, and perhaps more quietly, but equally significant, a number of ongoing disruptive trends, things like North Korea's steady but incremental progress in its nuclear weapons program. So taken together, this has created a world in 2016 that seems significantly more volatile than in previous years. Now, one of the things that we did in Jane's Intelligence Review at the end of 2016 is we put out an article that sought to set out a way of looking at 2017 as a more volatile world. And the way we did that was through the lens of 4 factors which we think are driving some of this volatility. And those are social disconnect, a growing distance between populations and the governments who rule them, changing alliances, so security arrangements that previously, since perhaps the end of the Second World War, have defined the way in which states react to each other's activities, being challenged or subverted, shifting territorial borders, so states being able to challenge internationally recognised borders with fewer and fewer consequences for them as actors, and also the evolving nature of warfare. And in particular for Jane's Intelligence Review, we've been interested in the way in which doctrines such as plausible deniability, which is inherently an intelligence doctrine, have increasingly come to play a role in the way in which states conduct warfare. And what we found is if you take those 4 factors, you can see ways in which they've come into play going back to effectively the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And a really good example of that is the year 2008, for instance, where we had, on one hand, the global economic crisis, which was a massive driver of social disconnect in Western countries. And in the same year, you have the case of Russia invading Georgia, which really speaks to things like those shifting international borders and the evolving concepts of warfare. And in particular, again, if you look at 2014, you can see the way in which Russia conducted its operations in Ukraine very much challenged the way in which people think about what one state invading the territory of another state looks like. The key thing about these trends that we've identified is that they have not gone away in 2017. So for people who saw 2016 as a particularly volatile year, a particularly disruptive or surprising year, all of those trends are going to come into play again in 2017, and that's reason to believe that 2017 will continue to be surprising and disruptive. It's a truism to say that it's hard to provide accurate analysis about the future. Forecasting, providing strategic warning is always going to be incredibly challenging. But it's even more difficult in an environment where there is an atmosphere of increased volatility, where predictions are being overturned, where polls are proving to fail to forecast the correct results. And this difficulty is exacerbated because very often the requirement from the customer, be that a policymaker or a decision maker, will be for the most likely scenario. People want to know what is going to happen. And what the events of 2016 have showed us is that you can provide an analysis of what you think is the most likely thing to happen, but it will also often be very useful to provide an analysis of those high impact, low probability scenarios, the things that may not be likely, they may be in fact very unlikely, but if they were to happen, would have a huge impact on the customer, would have a huge impact on, for instance, the business using corporate intelligence service, for instance. So what we try to do in Jane's Intelligence Review is think about the way you think about that uncertainty. And one simple model, one simple heuristic, would be to take that 4-part model we put forward, the 4 underlying factors that are driving this volatility, and using that as a way of checking your thinking. So if there's a particular scenario or event that you are looking at in the future, and it ticks one or more of those boxes, then there might be an argument for allocating more time and resources to looking at less likely but more serious, more impactful scenarios that could take place around it. Another thing we did in the article is produce an outlook for 2017. Now, normally what we would do with an article of that kind or a graphic of that kind is to analyse what you think the most likely things to happen in a particular country are, or the most likely developments on a particular thematic issue. We turned that paradigm on its head a little bit and examined scenarios that, while they may not be the most likely or even particularly likely, would have a high impact if they were to occur. So the inclusion of a particular country or a particular event on that map does not necessarily mean that we think it is a likely scenario, but it does mean that we think that if it did happen, it would be disruptive. And for that reason, it's worth an allocation of time and resources for analysts to look at in terms of developing an understanding of what that would mean if that came to pass. The key determining factor for a lot of the events that will take place in 2017 will be the posture adopted by Donald Trump in his first few months as president. So a lot of the comments that he has made since being elected and on the campaign trail would lead you to believe that there is a fairly high likelihood that he is going to attempt a reassessment of US policy towards countries like Russia and China, in particular on issues like the South China Sea or Ukraine, and that there could be changes, potentially significant changes, in the relationship with Iran and the nuclear deal, and around the conflict in Syria. What we've also seen, particularly since the election victory, has been a fairly unprecedented deterioration in relationships between Donald Trump and his administration and the US intelligence community on the other side. And that's something that has the potential to have an impact all the way down through Donald Trump's 4-year term, and it's something that, to Jane's Intelligence Review, we will obviously be following very closely. More broadly, in the world, there are a whole host of disruptive trends and events that we can say with a fairly high degree of certainty are going to take place. So, for instance, it's very likely that North Korea will continue with its parallel nuclear and ballistic missile programs, for example. And there's a reasonable probability that you'll see some sort of demonstration of that capability beyond what has previously been shown to the public in 2017. There are also likely to be further mass casualty terrorist attacks in Western Europe, for example. It would be surprising if the Islamic State didn't claim some sort of attack in 2017. And the impact that that has on the public perception of this group, along with also the social dynamics around mass immigration into Europe, have the potential to contribute to a further rise in the influence of the far right in countries like France and the Netherlands, for instance. And in some Western European countries, there are fairly significant elections coming up, and that might play a factor in that as well. So there's this whole host of factors that we can predict with a fairly high degree of certainty, but which are likely to continue to be disruptive. And there's also then the fact, as we've learned from 2016, that there's a whole host of things that we can't predict that seem much less likely, but have a potential to have a massive impact. And for that reason, the work of intelligence analysts, people looking at the future, people forecasting, will continue in 2017 to have to involve a consideration, not just of the most likely scenario of what we think is likely to happen, but also of those low probability, high impact scenarios which have the potential to upset everyone's calculations.